and welcome virtual space community to our this week's live stream about remote work and hybrid organizations. Last week, we had an intriguing conversation with Betsy Bowler. She's a remote evangelist at GitLab, and we talked about what are the folks over there at GitLab doing in order to keep the well-being and resilience of the remote workers. Today, I'm excited because I have another expert with decades of remote work experience on my show, and we're going to address another intriguing question. We're going to talk about why championing remote work is a viable economic policy. And with that, I'm happy to welcome on my stage with me, John Riordan.
Hi, Barbara. Thanks for having me today.
Hi there, John. How are you doing?
Very good indeed, thank you.
Fantastic. Where are you today connecting from?
I'm connecting from a very remote part of the southwest coast of Ireland. I am about 1 kilometer from the lighthouse on the southwestern tip of the coast, and delighted to say that I'm getting 1 gig broadband in the most beautiful part of the country. So remote work can happen anywhere.
Absolutely. And John, you have been a remote worker for over 20 years. So how did it come that you became a remote worker to start with?
Well, actually, I personally haven't been a remote worker, but I've been heavily involved in the remote work community. So let me just take it back. I lived and worked in the US for a long time. And in 2002, I was running the customer service operation for Virgin Atlantic Airways in the US. And post 9/11, significant challenge, high cost. We had to do something different. And we were approached by a company that was doing some remote work. So I took a look at it, and I championed the cause of remote work within the company. And one of the great things about working with a company like Virgin is they're kind of mad and crazy enough to go with mad and crazy ideas and really kick them around. So within about a year, we made a decision to really jump in and embrace remote work. And over the course of about a year or two, we replaced anybody who left the contact center world. We replaced them with a remote worker. And what we found was we were getting as good, if not better quality at a slightly better price. And it also gave us a significant element of resilience, because as an airline, we were based, a lot of the flights were coming in and out of the northeast of the US. And suddenly we had, if there was a major snowstorm, it impacted both our airports and all of our employees and our support workers. But now we suddenly had people distributed all over the US. So if we had a snowstorm, which is when you need your people on the phone, we had them all available. So we got some really simple, quick gains. So I was involved in that for a couple of years. And then I got approached by Apple in 2005, early 2006. They were doing some developmental work for a project that I didn't know much about, which ended up being the iPhone. And they were looking for an opportunity to scale massively like they'd never done before, in a way that they couldn't have done with a bricks and mortar contact center operation. So I joined Apple as a contractor, and I worked for a couple of years helping them build out remote work. And in fact, the very first call that Apple ever made to somebody working from home was in May of 2006. So it was about 13 months before the iPhone launched. So I was with Apple for a while. I went off and I worked directly for one of the companies in the remote working space. And then in 2010, I moved back to Ireland with Apple and ran the Apple support sales and service operation for Europe. And then about 5 years ago, I was contacted by Shopify, and the opening pitch from the recruiter at Shopify was, "You're probably not interested because we're a 100% remote company." And I literally bit the guy's hand off. This was the opportunity I was waiting for a long time, for a company that was fully committed to remote work. So in 2017, I ended up in a situation where I was now managing a country and an operation that was 100% remote. So that's kind of my backstory in terms of remote work.
Oh, wow. And so if we just dive into like the last position, the position for a 100% remote company with, I assume also many policies, procedures, and processes in place to be a good remote employer? What would you say Shopify stands out for when we talk about remote work?
Well, I'm no longer at Shopify, so I can't necessarily speak to what Shopify is doing at the moment. But what I can talk about is over the course of the 4.5 to 5 years I was there, fantastic company with a superb ethos towards remote work. And while I was there, the support organization, which was about 40% of the employees, was all remote. The other 60% were all office based. Something crazy happened, of course, in March 2020 that suddenly meant everybody needed to go remote. And the fantastic thing for the Shopify organization was they had an enormous cohort of 40% of people who were already working remote. And they had people in leadership levels at levels, multiple levels of leadership. So suddenly we were able to pair up with like-minded leaders in other organizations, other parts of the company. So essentially the 40% ingested the other 60%. And in very short order, Shopify was able to actually articulate publicly that they were going to become a remote first organization.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And just Barbara, to answer your question, like some simple policies. And I've listened to some of your sessions before, and there's loads and loads of great ideas that people have talked about. But the one that stands out for me at Shopify that helped us grow the organization in Ireland the most was we embraced what we would refer to as pop-up offices. So we allowed and encouraged employees to get together, and we, in many cases, we provided the funding for it, and we provided some logistical help. But we enabled people to get together as groups. They were disparate groups from different parts of the organization, but they would get together in a particular location. So if you're in a town and you have 20 Shopify employees across multiple disciplines, we would encourage them to rent a space, maybe once a month, and just go and work there. What it did was incredibly simple. It gave people a sense of community. So it's fine to work, a lot of your time in a remote, as many people would envisage, in your home or in your bedroom, and it's quite isolated. But to have that day a month or 2 days a month where you get the opportunity to do essentially the exact same that you're doing in your bedroom, but you're suddenly doing it in a conference room with other people. And what it does is it gives you the opportunity to scratch that itch that is community, to actually be there elbow to elbow with your colleagues, of course, socially distant, elbow to elbow. And that was one of the key things. And it helped people feel connected. Not everybody did it. Nobody was forced to do it. But everybody who did it thoroughly enjoyed it. And the interesting thing is when we had to stop doing it because of the pandemic, everybody complained, even the folks who had never been to a pop-up office, because the very fact that there was a connection point available was something that they wanted to keep, even if they never used it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I love that example. It's really powerful, John. And I only heard it before once from a client of mine who also established a similar system, because they are a distributed company within Austria, and they were also trying to connect there. And Austria is small, so of course there would have always been the possibility that everybody travels to a certain region because it's like maximum 5 hours away, or 6 hours away. But still, they encourage participants to set up those, they call it satellite offices, and they were also providing them with the funding to rent out a co-working or any other sort of area in order to meet up with the colleagues who are living or working close by. And what they even did, they really opened it up. It was sort of like I wouldn't say company event, but it was communicated company-wide. So when, for example, in Corinthian, they were having their pop-up or satellite office, and in a certain week, it was usually a few days a week, so that they were giving them more time for that. Other regions or colleagues from other regions could also join them. So they were trying to sort of give them also the possibility to join others while they're there. And well, as I said, I do know different dimensions. Austria, we are a really small country, so it's easy to travel there. But a fantastic example, and it's a small example or a small action with a huge impact.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point that you mentioned there, because obviously being based in Ireland and Austria, relatively small countries. And I think one of the great things about small countries that are open to remote work is, to me, it's a superpower. Because if you're at Canada or the US, a vast country, there's an inherent difficulty in getting people together to congregate for a day. It becomes a fairly significant challenge. But when you're in a relatively small country where the amount of time to travel between locations is significantly lower, and a lot of it can be done within a day, that it renders that country to have, to me, it's a superpower where you're remote, but you're small. And being a small remote enabled country is, to me, is a significant accelerant.
And I love that, John, because a friend of mine, she's a diversity strategist. She's always saying intercultural competence is a superpower, but also having a remote first mindset is definitely a superpower in 2022. Absolutely. And there are several reasons. Also, you're talking about a lot about talent, right? So why is the look at talent and remote work so important?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not an HR professional, so I can't profess to be an expert in the field. But what I can clearly say as a commentator and seeing this day in, day out, is that, look, the genie is well and truly out of the bottle. The last 2 years or 23 months has shown us that people can work from home. It's now, I think it's safe to say that it's actually impossible for any credible employer to contend that remote working doesn't work. Because let's be honest, remote working bailed your ass out. I mean, that's the best way to phrase it. I mean, remote working, suddenly people just tucked their laptop under their arm and off they went. It was a really bad experience for a lot of people. But guess what? People evolved over time. Companies evolved. They started sending the equipment to people's homes. They started providing a little bit more of a, let's call it a remote package. So even companies that never contemplated remote, they got there at different speed. Other companies that were remote ready were able to do it incredibly quickly. And those companies that were already doing remote didn't skip a beat. So from a talent retention perspective, I think we need to, let me just I want to zero in on one particular aspect of it for a second. I want to look at the impact on the freelance space. The number of companies now who are nervous about hiring remote freelance consultants is pretty much none, because the last almost 2 years, that nervousness that existed, that person, they need to come to the office and see how we work or whatever. No, the work needed to get done. I went looking for the expertise. I happened to find it. It might have been 5 time zones away, but I got the work done. And now I have a body I have an A/B sample of, do I not have the skill, or do I have the skill 5 time zones away that's already proven that they can do the work? Which am I going to go for? I'm going to go for having the skill. And in many instances, companies are discovering from a talent perspective that it can be cheaper also. Okay, because you're not paying for the office cost. And it's also, it's a variable cost rather than a fixed cost in many instances. So there's a huge kind of tell on that one. Another thing, you hear a lot about this term that's been cited, the Great Resignation. There was a really interesting study that I was looking at recently on the HR challenges for 2022 that was facing HR leadership in the US. I think it was a cohort of about 350 companies that were in this particular research. And the 5 things that they were asked about as major HR issues for 2022, no surprise: recruiting, retention, workforce planning, not surprising, vaccine mandates, of course, and then the 5th one was hybrid workforce. So here's the interesting thing. Almost 3 of those 5 are very much focused on the challenges that have been brought about by this whole talent retention and Great Resignation. So what are companies doing about it, and how are they changing? And one of the things that it's different in every region, different in every country, but I think the US, because it's such a large country and there's a lot of research there, it's a good bellwether to look at. And one of this particular survey that I cited a while ago, almost 50%, it was 48% of companies said that they were going to increase flexible working options, like such as hybrid, fully remote, or flexible hours. 48% for new hires and 44% for existing staff. And what I would contend is that 2 years ago, the concept of flexible work was, people paid lip service to it, and many HR professionals would have said, oh yeah, we do that. Oh, but we wouldn't. And I remember a very distinct situation with a major company where an HR VP said, yes, we're great, we have flexible working options, but we never allow people work on at home on Mondays and Fridays because, that's very bad policy. They'd be slacking off. Like, I'm sorry, those days are over. So from a retention perspective, what's happening is there's a fairly rapid change in how companies are approaching talent retention. And the key thing is they are now changing, and they're saying that over 50% almost 50% are saying they now have a very serious, valid, flexible option in place.
And I think also there is one thing that we also see is the game changed. It's leveled up. It's not only that you need to, because companies, in my opinion, I talk a lot about that with my clients, even though most of my clients, they are not remote first, they're still remote friendly, to be honest, but they are on the way to become remote first. But it's not just allowing home office, but having a good remote work mindset, the ethos that you were talking about being the strength of Shopify, that will be the game changer. Because we also do see the war for talent, and we don't find enough good people for the jobs that are in our organizations. And that's also why we really need to change our mindset. And all those aspects that you were mentioning, like we're not allowing Monday working from home or Fridays working from home, of course they show a lot of distrust, and that's what keeps people away from you as an employer, or they're going to leave you again. When you think about other aspects of organizational culture that are important to become a good remote employer, what would you recommend to look at?
Okay, to me, this boils down to two incredibly simple pillars. The first one you just mentioned there, you used the word distrust when you were talking negatively. The most important pillar is trust. And it is the way I like to explain it to people is, remember the old days when you were the hiring manager and you're looking at somebody across the desk and you're about to offer them the job. The feeling of trust you have in this person coming into your organization, right? That's what that high level of trust at that moment when you're trying to encourage somebody to come into the organization. That's the minimum level of trust you should have in your employees forever and ever and ever. And what happens with remote companies is they start with a high trust battery, and invariably they stay there. What we've tended to see is that companies that have been very, let's call them old school companies that have been office based, where there's a fair amount of presenteeism and a fair amount of authoritarian leadership, their starting point into the remote world is one of mistrust. And if your starting point is mistrust, it's very hard to build the trust battery. So to me, it's start with trust. Find the leaders in your organization who are trusted and who are the type of people who trust. Two very important aspects. Not everybody in your organization, not every leader in your organization is tailor-made to run a remote organization. You cannot, a leopard doesn't change its spots. I mean, you've got to be super careful about it. The right people. So trust is number one. The second one is intent. If you're half-assed about remote and it's like, oh, we'll try it, you're never really in there. This is whole heart and whole mind. Put it in there and get it done. And then when you're fully committed to remote. And it may well be a particular country or a division or a region or a product line. But if you're all in on the intent of this group or this cohort being remote, what you'll then find is intent is fine, but you need to provide content as well. And proper training about how to work remotely, what tools to use, how to engage. It's a very different managerial skill and a very different leadership skill than than the skill sets that many of the leaders in organizations throughout the world have grown up with. There are very few organizations that have been 100% remote for more than, let's say, 5 years. And I'm talking a tiny number of companies. So the body of work and how to do remote work, we are in the earliest of early days. We aren't even a toddler if you look at the life cycle of remote work. So you have to have that intent, and you have to understand that the content is there, but it's very early days, and that content is improving, and it's improving rapidly. The next thing to add on to that is technology. The technology that we use today for remote work is crap. Okay? This is technology that we never really expected to push as hard as we are now doing it. Okay, so like what you and I might be looking and saying, this StreamYard technology that we're looking at today, it's great, it's working really well. My guess is that the technology we would be using in a similar situation in a year's time would probably be 50% better, would be far more robust, would have more features, because that's what we've come to expect. Mm-hmm. So what I would say to leaders who are thinking about it is, don't think about a year ago when it was crap. Think about it in a year's time when it's going to be 50% better, and trust that the technologists are going to build it better. Don't be one of those nervous people who's like, oh no, I can't do it. Like, trust that we are going to evolve. As people, we're very, very good at evolving. So to me, it's trust, it's intent, it's content and technology.
Let me pick up on the metaphor that you were making about us being in a toddler phase when it comes to remote work. I really like that, because when we think about toddlers, it's all about falling, standing up, learning, relearning, and evolving. Also, one of the words that you were just currently using. And one of the things that I'm also looking into with the organizations that I work with, it's all about how do we learn from mistake, and how open mistakes and errors, and how open are we to experiment and try out new things. So when we think about toddlers and us being in a very early stage of remote work, of course, we also need to have a mindset that is not only open to remote work, but also a mindset that is very open to try out new things, not roll it out maybe for the whole organization, but try it out in small teams and have like a more MVP, minimal viable product mindset, where we also learn, get feedback, evolve, and change. So what do you think about that? Error culture, the culture, how we deal with mistakes and failures?
I go back to leadership behavior. When you're in a fully trusting, and I talked about you needing a leader who will trust people, but is also trusted by people. And what you typically find, the type of leader who's very open with their vulnerabilities is the type of person who is both trusting and trusted. So to me, it's the most important thing to look for in a leader, which is vulnerability. And that, to your point, Barbara, is the type of person who is willing to stand up and fall down, and stand up and fall down, and stand up and do it until they work out how to stand up properly. What you're not looking for is somebody who cannot let their mistakes be seen. You want somebody who's fairly open and who's saying, look, I'm on this journey as well. Come with me.
And I love that vulnerability as one of the personality traits that we are looking into leaders. And it's interesting because when I just look into my research, I've been researching new ways of working for the past 10 years as a professor at the university. It clearly is one of the things that in typical hierarchical organization is nothing that we would allow in leaders. So hierarchical organizations rather look for the impeccable, not showing any failure guy of leader, and very often guy of leader, than the one who shows vulnerability and mistakes that he or she learned from. Very, very interesting, Karen. Thanks so much, John. I want to dive in and dig into one topic that we also talked before. So it was about productivity. And I think this relates very much to the topic of trust. So as a researcher, and when I work with organizations, I like to base all my suggestions and consultations on evidence. Empirical based decision making is super important. And we do know, and that is interesting, that remote work makes us more productive if, of course, we have the right environment and we have the right tools.
Correct.
And we are also trained. So these are the things that you also already mentioned. But how do you see productivity being more connected to trust and remote work itself?
I'm going to start with the seminal research piece that's been done on remote work. Very famous piece of work that almost everybody who's involved in remote work has pored over. And that was the research that was conducted in 2013 by Professor Nicholas Bloom from Stanford University on a Chinese travel agency called Ctrip. And they looked at a cohort of 16,000 employees, and they had them work from home for a significant period of time, and they measured they took an enormous number of measurements. And what they found was that home working led to, and like, this is 9 years old. I mean, and this is tried and tested. And this was in a non-pandemic time. And this was where the company chose this, not the employees. And I'll come back to that in a second. So 13% performance increase from this particular cohort. And if you break down that 13, 9 of that 13% percentage points were from people working more minutes per shift. In other words, they were taking fewer breaks and, elongated breaks, and there were fewer sick days. No major surprise there. And 4% was on the other 4% so 9 and 4 for 13. The other 4% was taking more calls per minute, and that's primarily attributed, according to the participants in the survey, to a quieter working environment. So you had off the top, you had a 13% performance increase. Now, anybody out there, when you're talking about a large scale organization where you can get a 13% performance increase for the exact same cost, that's a staggering jump from a cost management perspective. Now, the interesting thing was that the employees also reported that they had improved work satisfaction, and they also had less turnover. So you had more productive, more satisfied, and less departures. On the downside, because there's always downside, what was seen was that the promotion rate of people who were working from home was not considered to be as good as the promotion rate of the cohort that stayed in the office. So one of the interesting things that Ctrip did, and that Nicholas Bloom was able to look at, was that they rolled out the option to work from home to the whole firm, and they allowed let's call them the experimental employees, or the people in the original cohort, to reselect between working in home or working in the office. And the interesting thing was over half of them switched. And this led to an interesting and a further interesting pieces, because then they'd studied the gains from these people who had experience of doing it, and now they'd selected to go into it. Their productivity gains almost doubled, went from 13% to 22%. So you then had this incredible selection bias as well, which was like, I know this is going to work. And so basically the shackles are off, I'm fully in. So to me, that secondary cohort, that secondary slice of people who I would call the all-in group, a 22% gain is bonkers. And to me, it highlights the incredible benefits of learning and the selection effects when you're adopting kind of relatively, a relatively modern management practice. Now, where this is interesting, post-pandemic, is the vast majority of people who worked from home for the last 2 years didn't select to work from home. So the interesting thing now, and which is what's facing all of the HR professionals, is They can't say that working from home doesn't work because they've asked employees to do it and they've done it. Now they pretty much need to say, and for those of you who want to work from home, you can work from home. What's going to be really interesting to watch is what that will do to productivity gains. And I think we're going to see a productivity uptick that's going to be quite sizable.
But I need to reinforce here, we do know also, probably you from your work with the organizations, that the productivity gains only increase if you also have set up the infrastructure, the skills development. If in a pandemic, and we can just not compare that, because we do know that in a pandemic situation, there were people working from home with toddlers, with dogs, with everything around them. So of course, productivity at some point can also drop in such circumstances. So a remote first environment or remote work environment is not to be compared with the pandemic environment, even though we have seen that through the pandemic, as you mentioned, also those who were never allowed to work from home because it's impossible that a secretary works from home, right, have now been shown that, and they have been shown, well, it works if I work from home. And indeed, even though I never thought so, I do like it. I do prefer not to have to commute. I do prefer being at home and having more time for work, more quiet time for work, if the setup is right. John, you are now the chairman of Grow Remote. So for our listeners, how do they connect with you? One thing is, of course, over LinkedIn, our main platform. John Riordan, you find him here on LinkedIn. But let us also know a little bit about Grow Remote and your position and function there as a chairman.
Yeah, so Grow Remote is an organization that started in Ireland about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's to give a voice to the community that is remote work, because the employees don't necessarily have a voice because they work for multiple companies, and many of them are independently are freelance consultants and also work for companies. So they don't necessarily have a collective voice. There's a lot of communities, small towns and economic districts and whatever, that don't necessarily have an organization that speaks for them. And then you have a lot of governmental agencies in different countries who are trying to find out what to do. And there's no one person bringing all of those entities together, the communities, the companies, and the employees. And that's what Grow Remote does. And Grow Remote, the founders of Grow Remote 3 or 4 years ago in Ireland, it was really to kind of help rural Ireland kind of be more embracing of workers and give people a healthy place to work. The fascinating thing is the way in which it's exploded. The even more fascinating thing is how it is now spreading into multiple other countries. And the essence of it is to give a voice to the whole structure, the whole infrastructure that is screaming out for more remote. So what we're now finding is that, a simple thing, I'm going to use LinkedIn and other platforms for a second as an example. It's still difficult in many of the recruitment platforms, or it's not first nature, let's say, in these platforms, to actually choose remote. In many companies, you still have to choose a location, or it'll default to the location of the head office of the company. So let's play out the scenario. Imagine a company that has no head office. And that's feasible now because we have companies that have spawned in the last 2 years who will have essentially no location. Look, they're location agnostic. How are these platforms going to deal with that? Incredibly simple stuff. So Grow Remote's a fascinating organization. It's one I'm deeply involved in and have been involved from the start. And anybody who wants to reach out to me, the easiest way to do it is via LinkedIn. And by the way, Barbara, thank you for getting the pronunciation of my name correct.
Oh, cool. Fantastic. Thank you so much. And John, we also do know LinkedIn just recently added the feature of having remote job opportunities. And I do think there's still a bug there, because I think we need to go over an office or like a location and then add the remote work option or something. So it's not yet totally working, but it is there already. John, It was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn live show. And I definitely am going to follow you and also what is going to happen with Grow Remote and where you develop into. Thanks so much for being there, John. You know, I have a virtual cocktail prepared for you and I'm joining you backstage in a second.
Thanks, Barbara. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Virtual Space Hero community. We received a lot of questions beforehand for today's conversations that we built in. If you have more questions, you know that you can just reach out to John or to me via the event or via our profiles on LinkedIn. You know that next week we are continuing our journey and we're going to talk about how do you engage people across time and space. So don't miss this upcoming Virtual Space Hero live show and stay connected and stay healthy. Have a lovely morning, afternoon, or evening. Bye.